And welcome everybody to another edition of Historical Geocaching on the Road with geocacher T and Photobug from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Currently having a blast traveling all over New England, visiting all sorts of cool Adventist historical sites. Today we are filming on location in the bus, currently in New Hampshire in the beautiful fall color. Having a lot of fun. We are heading on our way to Hastings Potato Patch and later on to the Washington, New Hampshire Church. Come along with me as I discover the awesome history of these sites.
Stay left.
Just a beautiful view out here today. We have now arrived at the Leonard Hastings Potato Patch. You may be thinking, what's so significant about a potato patch? Well, there's a story that I shall tell you. Leonard Hastings was a Millerite, expecting his Jesus to come as other Millerites did on October 22, 1844. And because they thought Jesus was coming so soon, they had no need of or want of material possessions, often giving a lot of their possessions away and so they can get some money to give even more money to furthering of the good news that Jesus was coming on October 22, 1844, as they had sincerely believed. And the potatoes were going to come ripe in the fall, and Leonard Hastings, all the other potato farmers dug up their potatoes, but Leonard Hastings didn't. And one sad thing was that this disease, I forget what it was called, but it totally ruined everyone's potatoes. Well, Leonard Hastings didn't get around to digging up his potatoes until the spring of 1845. Right, this field right here actually is his potato patch, and guess what? Those potatoes were just perfect and ready to sell, and he made a lot of money that he was able to help the Sabbatarian Adventists, which became the Seventh-day Adventists when they took their name in 1863. Which, anyway, really cool story, really neat to actually be at these locations. Check this out, folks. Check this out. Hastings Potato Patch for yourself. Here it is.
Bypass that lake and go straight by.
Especially if it's stupid. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is. But when you get syrup out of it.
And welcome everybody to Washington, New Hampshire. Guess what we found here? Surprise, surprise, a historical marker. Seal of the State of New Hampshire, 1776, birthplace of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In April 1842, a group of citizens in this town banded together to form the first Christian society. In the Adventist movement of 1842 to 1843, they espoused the Advent hope. In January 1862, these Washington Sabbath keepers, after meeting for many years as a loosely knit group, organized as the first Seventh-day Adventist Church, and says, to get there, take the second left, opposite the common, 2.3 miles on Millen Pond Road to the site of this building. Anyway, I just think that's some really neat history to actually be here, and guess what? We are going to be headed to that church next, so see you there. And believe it or not, folks, we are here at the Washington, New Hampshire Seventh-day Adventist Church. My understanding is that this is one of the first, if not the very first, Seventh-day Adventist church where a company of believers kept a Sabbath, Seventh-day Sabbath, and a little later another tour group, sorry for the shakiness, is going to meet up with us, and they are going to, their leader, Elder Nix, is going to tell some stories, so we're going to get together.
Got too dark in here, no one can see anything. All right, in 1839, you all came through the town square, our group, your group, you all came through the town square. You saw the church up there, the Congregational Church. Well, in 1839, that church was built. And in 1842, 32 members decided that was just too high religion for them. They weren't going to go to that any longer. It was too high society. So they decided to build this little church out here. And among them was Daniel Farnsworth, and he had some sons, William Farnsworth, and a younger brother, Cyrus Farnsworth, that we'll be talking about more in a couple of minutes. The land for this church, supposedly, there's two different accounts. This is the problem. I need to just fess up right now. There are various accounts of what happened. They're all memory statements from many years later. I've put the story together in one way, what seems plausible to me. If you read it slightly different from some other perspective, well, that's what seemed plausible to that person. But we're all dealing with the same data, and that is that different people remember different things slightly differently at different times in later years. So they built this church out here. It took them 6 weeks to build it. And there was a young minister at that time who served this congregation. His name was Frederick Wheeler. Frederick Wheeler was a Methodist circuit riding preacher. Usually you see a much older picture of him. This one turned up a few years ago and a lot much better, even though it's slightly out of focus. I still like the younger picture of him. He was born in 1811, and he would live till 1910, so he was almost 100 when he died. He is generally considered to be our first Seventh-day Adventist minister. That's debatable, but it's what's usually said about him. In 1842, the reason it's debatable is because when did we become a Seventh-day Adventist? Not until 1860. We had a lot of ministers, so how would you know which was the first one? Anyway, in 1842, 1843, the Millerite message reached clear inland here into Washington, New Hampshire. The Reverend Joshua Goodwin came, and interestingly, he married a young lady. There's some speculation, at least I've wondered when I read, did he come here to court her and then preach the message? Or did he preach the message and find her and court her? I don't know. Anyway, he got married, and he also preached the Millerite message here. And so, some in this, or most of them in this congregation became Millerites. That doesn't mean Sabbath keepers, it means they're Millerite Adventists. They expect the Lord to come very shortly. In 1843, late 1843, a young girl who was about 18 years of age at the time, Rachel Delight Oakes, was invited to be the school teacher here. Now, we usually call her Delight because her mother was Rachel Oakes. And to avoid confusion, even though the daughter was Rachel Delight Oakes, usually you'll find in history books she's called Delight and the mother's called Rachel. So we're going to do that here in this next few minutes. So Rachel Delight Oakes, or Delight Oakes, comes here, and she rents a home in here's Daniel Farnsworth, the one that I mentioned a minute ago. One of Daniel's sons, Cyrus Farnsworth, had a house and rented a room to Delight. And Delight's mother also came along, and her name was Rachel Oakes, as I just mentioned. And the two women were Seventh-day Baptists. They were not Millerites at this point. They were Seventh-day Baptists. So they're keeping this, which day? Sabbath, the Seventh-day Sabbath, right. So they would keep the Sabbath themselves because there were no other Seventh-day Baptists around here. Then on Sunday, they would come here to worship for Christian fellowship. They would come to this church, not because they believed in the day, they knew it was the wrong day, but because they needed fellowship. And so that's how come they happened to be here. Well, one Sunday morning, Frederick Wheeler is here in the pulpit. You've all heard the story probably, or many of you have, but you may not have heard here, told where it happened. Frederick Wheeler is here in the pulpit, and they're having communion service. And he said to the congregation, if you wish to participate in the communion service today, You should be a keeper of God's 10 Commandments. Now, what do you think is going through Rachel Oak's mind, wherever she's seated out here? What do you think she's thinking? Well, what about you, Cumber Wheeler? You've got the wrong day already. But anyway, she didn't say anything. And so they went through the service. The next week, she saw the minister, and then she had plenty to say to him. She said, last Sunday, when you said just before the Lord's Supper that if you were going to participate, you should be a keeper of all of God's 10 Commandments, I almost stood up and told you to put the cloth back over the emblems until you started keeping the 4th commandment. Now guess who's surprised? Elder Wheeler. Somewhere here I even have a picture of Rachel I should show you. There she is. Rachel. She's accosted the preacher. She's up to the occasion. She gives him some Seventh-day Baptist literature. It's interesting that the Seventh-day Baptists, up to about 2 years before that, had really tried to do no evangelism. Talk about God's timing. They really had not done anything in terms of evangelism. They just kind of raised their own kids. If somebody asked, they could join their church. And just a year or two before, they had taken an action at their Seventh-day Baptist General Conference that they needed to start distributing this literature and start evangelizing, telling people about Seventh-day Sabbath. And here Rachel, doing something for the Seventh-day Baptist General Conference it said their members should do, she's now witnessing and sharing with Frederick Wheeler. Well, Wheeler was a good, honest minister, and so he takes the literature that she gives him, and he decides that the seventh day is the Sabbath. And in fact, he preached his first sermon over in Upper Hillsboro, on March 16, 1844, he preached his first sermon on the seventh-day Sabbath over in Hillsboro, New Hampshire. Upper Hillsboro, not very far from here. In fact, we had somebody talking on our bus, or I would have shown you the road that we on our bus, that you go down about half a mile down to where the little schoolhouse was, where we think that first Sabbath-keeping Adventist preached. Now, so instead of just a circuit-riding Methodist minister who's become a Millerite, now you have a circuit-riding Methodist Millerite Sabbath-keeping minister. Because Frederick Wheeler is now a Sabbath-keeper. Still a Methodist, still a Millerite, hasn't left his Methodist church, but he is out preaching and sharing the Sabbath. Now, if you look in Millerite literature leading up to October 22, 1844, you will discover some discussion of the seventh-day Sabbath, but not much. Why? Well, because they didn't want to do anything to lose the focus on the second coming. And they said, if we're supposed to be keeping the seventh-day Sabbath in a few weeks, or months, or weeks, when the Lord gets here, he'll tell us and make it all straight, so don't do anything about it now. But Frederick Wheeler and Rachel, they're preaching a little bit, or at least sharing their faith about the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, accounts differ as to when the next part of the story happened. Whether it's 1844, it's after the disappointment. They're all united on that. Is it right after the disappointment, or early January of 1845? So late 44, early 45, when did this next event happen? We don't know, but on one Sunday morning, this man stood up, William Farnsworth. William Farnsworth was a farmer in the community. He announced that from henceforth, he and his family were all going to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, that was a fairly major statement at that time because he had fathered 7 children. 6 of them were still living at that time. Eventually, he will father 22 children. So when he's announcing what he and his family are going to do, you can see it's a good sizable portion of this congregation that will be doing whatever Dad says we're all going to be doing. Anyway, William Farnsworth, not long after that, a week or two later, his father, Daniel Farnsworth, stood up and said, we're going to keep the Sabbath. And Cyrus Farnsworth stood up about the same time his father did, said, we're going to keep the Sabbath. So you have a nucleus of Sabbath keepers here in this little congregation. Now, I've had some fun looking for pictures. I like old pictures. Here are 19 of the 22 children of William Farnsworth. So they really were real people. Here's their mugshots of the Farnsworth kids as they grew up here in this community. All right, so they're here. You might be interested in this. At one point in his life, it is said that William Farnsworth weighed 260 pounds. But he started out, I can't even believe this, but this is what I read in some Farnsworth family stuff. He started out weighing 2.5 pounds. They could put the little baby in a teapot, it said. He grew so much from there to 260 pounds. Anyway, they all accepted the Sabbath. Daniel Farnsworth, the father, was a typical outspoken Yankee, and he is recalled as having said on at least one occasion, maybe more, as they would get into disputes here in the church. I mean, they were human too. A little less straight testimony and a little more straight living will be better for all of us. So quit telling your neighbors off. Don't tell them what to do. Start living it. Don't tell everybody. Anyway, there were probably at that point 12, 13 members. Some say it's 40, but nobody believes it now. There are old figures who 40 individuals accepted the Sabbath. It was probably closer to 12 to 15. Became the nucleus of this church sometime in early 1845. Now on my bus I was asked, is this the oldest Seventh-day Adventist church? Well, it depends on how you define the oldest Seventh-day Adventist church. It is the oldest congregation of Sabbath-keeping Adventists, but this building did not become a Seventh-day Adventist church until about 1862. Why? Because the members owned the church, and the majority of the members were still Sunday keepers. So it wasn't until the early 1860s that the Sabbath keepers that still had their ownership here, they outnumbered the Sunday keepers, and this became a Seventh-day Adventist church. So it's not technically the oldest Seventh-day Adventist church, but it's certainly it's the oldest congregation. It is one of the oldest churches, and it is the most famous of the early churches. Now, how did the Sabbath get from here to Joseph Bates? Have you been down to Fairhaven yet? You've been there, so you've heard the story about, what's the news, Captain Bates? All right. How did all that happen? Well, again, I'm just going to conjecture with you because no Adventist historian that I have read or that I have figured out myself absolutely knows. But here's my conjecture. Frederick Wheeler is a circuit-riding Methodist, Millerite, Sabbath-keeping Adventist pastor. There are other circuit-riding pastors around. One of them was Thomas Preble, who you heard about. At least my group heard about. I'm sure they did, okay? Heard about Thomas Preble, T.M. Preble. He lived over Nashua, New Hampshire. They probably came together at some point and met and talked. And it was T.M. Preble that wrote the article in the Hope of Israel, the paper that Joseph Bates read and accepted the Sabbath from. Now, when Joseph Bates decides that he wants to come up here to this area to learn more about the Sabbath, who does he come see? Does he go see Preble? No. He comes up to see Frederick Wheeler. Now, we don't have the letters to prove this, but here's my conjecture. He probably wrote to Preble. That's what you would naturally do if you've read an article in a paper that you're impressed with. And you would say to them, I'd like to come study more about the Sabbath. My guess is Preble wrote back and said, the person I got it from that you really need to talk to is Frederick Wheeler. Because about 10 o'clock at night, Bates arrives up here. Probably it was in the spring of 1845, and knocks on the door, and according to the story, a sleepy-eyed Frederick Wheeler gets up and goes to the door to see who in the world is knocking at 10 o'clock at night on the door, way out here in the middle of nowhere. And here is bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Joseph Bates. He's arrived from Fairhaven, and he's ready to study. And so guess what? You get the candles out, and you study. And they studied the Sabbath the rest of the night. Then they came over here to Cyrus Farnsworth's home, which at least our group's going to drive by. Yours probably will on the way out. I don't know what you're doing. But anyway, Cyrus Farnsworth's home. Right in front of that were 3 large maple trees that stood until 1988 when they were blown down in the storm. And the men sat there and studied the Bible underneath those old maple trees. Well, they were told then. But those maple trees. And then Bates is all ready to go home. He's got all his answers now. And that's when he goes back down to New Bedford, crosses the wooden bridge over the Acushnet River, and bumps into that guy with that patriotic name, James Madison Monroe Hall, who says, Captain Bates, what's the news? And Bates says, the news is the 7th day's the Sabbath. Now you've got the whole picture of how it happened from down there to up here, studying the Sabbath and going back down there. And Bates then becomes the apostle for the Sabbath. Nobody has proven that one little link between Preble and Wheeler. It's just conjecture. But my conjecture is since Bates, as I said, came up here to talk to Wheeler and not to Preble, that there must have been a connection there that we don't have any correspondence or any documentation for today. So Joseph Bates goes back down there. He writes his little pamphlet on the Sabbath, 46, 48-page pamphlet. James and Ellen White, the newlyweds, get married August 30, 1846. I don't know that it was a wedding present from Joseph Bates, but anyway, right afterwards, they get a copy of that pamphlet, and they accept the Sabbath. And so you can see how from this little place here, like dropping a pebble in a pond, the ripples go out and out and out and out to what today I understand we have, what, a little over 18 million members, official members, Sabbath keepers around the world, and it all started from a little pebble dropped in the pond here by a lady who was upset at her pastor for saying, if you're going to participate in the communion service, you need to be a keeper of the commandments. And she said, no, not until you start on the fourth one.
And thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you had a lot of fun learning some more about Seventh-day Adventist history. I sure have enjoyed making these videos. Hope you've enjoyed watching them. Be sure to check out more of my cool videos, both Adventist history videos and otherwise, at my YouTube channel. That's www.youtube.com/tnphotobug. And until next time, this is Geocacher TN Photobug signing out. I am most definitely having a blast with Bast.